Thank you, Dr. Nichols. Before I start, just to precisely locate the area I'm talking about, if you visualise a map of South Australia and look at the very far northeastern corner, it's roughly the area where the Queensland, South Australian and New South Wales borders intersect, just a little north of that, centred on the point where Cooper's Creek crosses the South Australian border out of Queensland. It's mainly pastoral country, with the exception, of course, of the Moomba area, which, of course, now is probably carrying a larger population than the area has ever up till this point. So Cooper's Creek is, by anyone's definition, somewhat remote. Inaminka is about 1,300 kilometres from Adelaide. By plane, a matter of hours, or 2 days steady drive for the average motorist, provided always that it hasn't rained. The region is desert, sandy desert, stony desert and riverine desert, with occasional rocky hills to provide interest. The saving grace in this arid wilderness is the Cooper, with its tree-covered floodplain and lovely permanent waterholes, which made it a marvellous habitat for the Aborigines and a very attractive prospect for European settlers. The climate is typical of arid zones. Mild winter days with sharp frosts at night and summers of absolutely searing heat. Sturt recorded temperatures up to 61 degrees, while settlers reported regular spells in the 50s. Access was difficult in the 19th century. Horseback, horse-drawn vehicle or foot power were the only options. The arrival of the Great Northern Railway at Farina put its passengers still about 10 days coach drive from Inaminka. The people who lived in this region were generally forgotten by the cities, firstly because of the distances involved and the difficulty of communication, and secondly because the population was so small. So remote is the Cooper that the first settlers didn't arrive until the early 1870s. When they did, the hand of government was quick to reach out, as always. And in 1874, troopers based at Mount Freeling Police Station on the northern edge of the Flinders Ranges made the first patrol into the Strzelecki Valley to Tinga Station. This was followed in 1876 by a two-man patrol, again from Mount Freeling, up the Cooper to Inaminka, to gather census and statistical returns. This latter patrol was the first contact between the Upper Cooper settlers and the South Australian police. The journey of 1,104 kilometres took just over a month. On the Queensland side of the border on the Cooper, settlers were under the protection of the Queensland Native Police under European officers, who set up a police camp about 160 kilometres upstream from Inaminka. The Native Police were a controversial body whose activities were the subject of much debate, and perhaps fortunately for the Cooper's Creek Aborigines, the police camp was soon removed. This left the border Queenslanders dependent for all practical purposes on the South Australian Police for protection. The system of policing by patrols from Mount Freeling and then from Beltana was far from satisfactory, but went on through the 1870s into the early 80s. The decision to eventually establish a police station at Inaminka was taken in 1878, but until this actually took place, the patrols continued by horse and from the end of the 1870s by camels supplied by the Beltana Pastoral Company. In view of the proposal for a reenactment of a police camel patrol for the bicentennial, it's instructive to look at one of these camel patrols in detail. In March 1882, there began one of the longest patrols ever undertaken from Beltana into the Cooper region and beyond. Mounted Constables Fernbrand and Humphreys set out on the 7th of March, which is still pretty hot, on camels, with pack camels Polly and Tommy stringing along. The purpose of the patrol was the collection of livestock returns for the government and an attempt to get firm evidence of sly grog selling then rife in the area, so that an example could be made of someone as a deterrent to the rest of the sellers. The constables crossed the Flinders Ranges to Blinman, the little copper mining town. Here they spent 2 days repairing saddles ready for the patrol, then took the track over to Wirialpa Station on the eastern side of the ranges. They followed the foothills north past Mount Chambers and Waltana, spelling the camels about every 4th day, called at Moolawatna at the top of the ranges, then swung northeast across the Stony Downs to the plains and dry channels surrounding Lake Callabonna and out to Callabonna Station. Statistics collected, they went north to Montecolina, to Tinga Tinga on the Strzelecki Creek, then swung across roughly northwest to Katapiri on the Cooper Channel, where they spelled their camels while they tried to get evidence of sly grog selling. Returning to the Strzelecki track, they continued to Inaminka and made camp. While the camels rested the next day, the constables walked to Kalamurra Station a few kilometres upstream to collect their statistics. The next day as they rested, rain set in and the camels strayed, to be found 4 days later and 60 kilometres away. The constables attempted to cross the flooded Cooper when they got back, but the camels refused to face the torrent for 2 frustrating days. Finally persuaded, they were taken up to Kalamurra Station and spelled for 3 days before going over the border to Napameri Station, still on the Cooper. One camel, Tom, went lame and they had to turn back. The next day, Constable Wurmbrand went up to Napameri on Polly, who promptly got lost, and a whole day was spent looking for her. They spent the next 6 days nursing Tom before heading north towards Haddon Downs. With the station still 50 kilometres off, the ungrateful Tom repaid their tender loving care by knocking Wurmbrand down while he was removing the hobbles. The constable was laid up for 4 days with a sprained ankle. On the track again, they were on the stony downs of Sturt Stony Desert. The camels suffered greatly in the hard going, though there was at least abundant feed and water for them after the recent rains. The situation was less rosy for the constables. When they arrived at Haddon Station, they found the owner very short of rations, and though willing enough, could supply much less than they had hoped for. There was then no track at all between Haddon and neighbouring Cadelgo stations. The constables had to walk, and the camels picked their way between rocks and stones for 65 kilometres, with neither guide nor compass. Cadelgo too was almost out of rations, having only fresh beef, milk and a bag of flour left, but again the manager was as generous as circumstances allowed. From Cadelgo they struck north to the Queensland border. They visited the Bluff and Pandy Pandy stations, where Humphreys hired horses to go twice to Birdsville for supplies, bought at exorbitant prices, the principles of supply and demand having come into play after the floods. They could then proceed down the Diamantina to Clifton Hill Station, where they tried, again unsuccessfully, to get evidence of sly grog trading. They turned back towards the Cooper, and from some drovers they met, they learned that a lunatic was at large in the Sandhill country. After several days' tracking, they found him, and with much difficulty, he was extremely violent, arrested him. The half-starved man consumed an alarming amount of their expensive rations, putting the constables again on a restricted diet. At last the patrol turned south to Coongie in the Cooper Lake system, where their prisoner attacked Humphreys as he ate his supper and had to be chained until he quietened. At Inaminka they spelled for a day before beginning the long haul down the Strzelecki Creek again. The camel Tom had a fight during the night with a Botana Pastoral Company teamster's bull camel and had to be spelled for a day with a swollen fetlock. At Tingatingana they found all the hands fighting drunk. The teamster who had brought up rations for the station had also speculated in some villainous rum for which he found a ready market. The man was still camped nearby. Humphreys disguised himself as a station hand, and in company with one of the genuine article visited the teamster's camp and easily persuaded him to sell 3 bottles of rum for 10 shillings a bottle, thus catching him red-handed. The information was laid before the owner of Tingatingana as a justice of the peace. Summonses were issued, served and executed, while a search uncovered a 5-gallon keg of the dubious rum planted in the sandhills. While they were thus happily occupied, 2 more camels came plodding up through the sandhills bearing Mounted Constable Cornelius Power, with native constable Jimmy Maruya, following a tip-off that the teamster was selling sly grog. Power waited with his colleagues until they were ready to head south to help with the insane prisoner. Even with this added supervision, the man escaped, to be found next day, thanks to the native constable's tracking skills, 16 kilometres away. Meanwhile, that irritating camel Tom had strayed and was found only after a 70-kilometre search. Certainly Mounted Constable Wurmbrand must have been glad to arrive back at Beltana at the end of the patrol with 2,704 kilometres and hand over to his sergeant his lunatic and the 5-gallon rum keg as evidence at last of sly grog selling. Not the least of his pleasures would have been the return of Tom the camel to Beltana station. I should perhaps point out that despite this unpromising start, camels were ideally suited to the far northern environment. They could be conditioned to go for long periods without water and could browse successfully on a variety of vegetation, remaining in good condition where a horse would starve. They were steady goers, up to 80 kilometres a day when ridden, and though hopeless in the wet, excelled over sandy country where, after all, it didn't often rain. Once the constables got used to them, they proved a godsend and were still being used for the occasional cross-country patrol right into the 1930s and 40s. As a postscript to the camel patrol, the lunatic was committed to the asylum in Adelaide. The rum keg continued to bring trouble. For a while later it was missing. The constables disclaimed all knowledge of it. Then the native constable admitted having taken it and drunk the contents, with what effect is not recorded. Maruya was arrested, suspended and dismissed from the force, and the keg was sold at auction for 5 shillings. The offending teamster was fined £20 in costs, but it is doubtful if that had any deterrent effect whatever on his fellows. The combination of enormous distances and the small population made the administration of the law in the far northeast almost impossible. The settlers grew restless and badgered the police commissioner for proper police protection, both from the Aborigines, who were numerous, and lawbreakers, who were few but annoying. In August 1882, the commissioner informed landholders that 3 mounted constables had been detailed for duty in their neighbourhood. When Mounted Constable Cornelius Power arrived back from the long patrol just described, he was told he was to be officer in charge of the new Inaminka police station. Cornelius Power, an Irishman, was an active and intelligent man, successful at his job and respected by his colleagues, and greatly admired by the public for his dogged pursuit of lawbreakers in a series of long patrols, during one of which he covered 1,232 kilometres in 26 days. Inspector Beasley, the divisional head, considered him the best officer in the Far Northern Division, and that he had the judgment and discretion necessary for the post of officer in charge. He would have under him 2 other men, the 3-man staffing, because it was thought unsafe for a man to travel alone through this hazardous region. The constables took with them the barest essentials to establish a police camp, namely, a large tent with fly and floor cloth, 2 pairs of blankets, 3 water buckets, 1 neck chain and 3 pairs of handcuffs to restrain prisoners, 2 deal forms, 1 frying pan, 1 hammer, 1 stable lantern, 6 pannikins, 1 office ruler, 1 shovel, 1 table, 12 Acts of Parliament, 1 mailbag and 1 boiler. Also from Beltana station, 1 chain, 1 rifle, 1 calico fly and a pack saddle and bags which had to be returned. Even including their personal effects, life in the new camp was far from luxurious. They took with them 3 camels, including the notorious Tom, 5 horses and a supply of stores. Once settled, Power selected land for a police paddock and the constables began work. The neighbours were the Aborigines, the men on the local cattle stations, local meaning within a radius of 200 kilometres, and within a few years the tiny settlement of Inaminka Township. The European population was almost exclusively male and at this time numbered about 200, rising to a peak of about 1,000 in the early 1890s. Power and his men were responsible not only for the administration of the white man's law, but also the physical welfare of the Aborigines and the safety of all travellers. They also represented all other government departments as required. Even with the police in residence at Inaminka, distance remained a problem. The nearest JP was over 130 kilometres away down the Strzelecki. When a theft was reported, a constable had therefore to ride 260 kilometres to get a warrant before he could begin the pursuit. The appointment of 2 local justices eventually solved this problem. Meanwhile, you remember the bit about judgment and discretion. Part of Mounted Constable's recent past caught up with him. While stationed at Beltana, he'd met an attractive 35-year-old brunette, and, in her words, they kept company for nearly 6 months. At the end of this time, the constable, playfully locking them both in a partly built police cell, refused to open the door until he'd had his wicked way with her. After that, the affair cooled noticeably, as often happens. The lady left Beltana, but heard from others that Power was talking publicly of the affair in a way which discredited her shamefully. She went to Adelaide, complained to the police commissioner, and bought some men's clothing and a revolver. In February 1883, she arrived at Inaminka and marched into the police camp to threaten Power, gun in hand. Mounted Constable Spicer disarmed her, Power arrested her, and when they left soon after for Beltana to take a horse thief to trial, they took her with them. The journey to Beltana was long, hard and hot, and they had no hope of arriving in time for the trial. They camped on the track and Power rode ahead to explain the delay at Beltana, leaving Spicer to follow with the prisoners. In the extreme heat, the thief could not be left chained to a small tree where he'd spent the night, so he was put in the tinga-ting in a woolshed. The lady being free to move about, the prisoners fraternised until at sundown the thief was again chained to the tree. During the night a sandstorm blew up and Spicer, worried about his prisoners, didn't fall asleep until after midnight. Well might he have worried. When he woke up, the horse thief was gone, and the lady who had released him rejoicing greatly at Spicer's embarrassment. The sandstorm had obliterated all tracks and the constable could only press on with starving, thirsty horses to report the loss of his prisoner. The lady was tried some weeks later and bound over to keep the peace. Power, meanwhile, pursued his horse thief with characteristic energy and determination, recovering him and earning a reward of £15. Spicer was censured and fined for his carelessness, which seems a little unfair. Life for the men at Inaminka returned to normal. The summer of 1884 was savagely hot, with temperatures rising to the low 50s, and 5 men died on the track. In one case, the Inaminka police were unable to investigate because there was 96 kilometres of waterless country between them and the dead man. Then, the case of the wrong lady cropped up again. In August, she was arrested for having uttered threats against Power and tried at Port Augusta, where the judge found the grounds for the information trivial and awarded her compensation of £5. However, she was rearrested in September on the same charge and tried again, and once more bound over to keep the peace. However, during the trial, all the details of her involvement with Power became public knowledge, and despite the verdict, the sympathy of the court was with the lady. As for the general public, their idol having been found to have feet of clay, they turned violently against Power. A letter to the Observer commented, "Policemen cannot be expected to be more moral than members of Parliament, great swells and others, but certainly the police station and cells ought to be sacred against the violation of female virtue. And to keep a man like Cornelius Power in the force after his own confession of his guilt is a scandal on the morals of any Christian and civilised country." Accordingly, Power was discharged from the South Australian Police Force. He was too fine a policeman to be wasted, however, and with the approval of the Chief Secretary, he was reinstated to take charge of the native police in the Northern Territory, where he continued to give noble service. Meanwhile, the police camp, while perhaps having some aesthetic charm, was eminently unsuitable for a permanent police station. The contractor began the construction of a stone building late in 1883. The work was still incomplete when in 1885 torrential rains and a flood in the Cooper which rose to lap round the walls virtually demolished the structure. It would have been local stone held together with mud plaster. To add to the constables' difficulties, the back of their tent was blown out in the same storm, and as the fly was now worn out, they were for all practical purposes homeless. The manager of Inaminka Station nearby came to the rescue with a small hut near the site of the wrecked police station as a temporary rented substitute until the new station could be rebuilt. This substitute station was far from grand. The hut was timber slabs, clay plastered, roofed with iron, and of only 2 rooms. The constables divided these to make 4 tiny rooms, put a wood block floor in the kitchen and a calico ceiling in the bedroom, and added a veranda. There was no cell, and all prisoners, Aboriginal and white, were chained to a post outside. Like many temporary arrangements, the tiny police station became permanent and remained the base for the Cooper Police until 1929, when it was replaced with a wood and iron building and a real cell. Life on the Cooper for the constables was either utter tedium, riding routine patrols and filling out a multitude of government forms, or life and death drama in search of missing men, investigating accidental death, suicide, or rarely murder. Probably the worst duty was the burial of those who had perished along the track. These bush burials were described by one as trying experiences, surely a massive understatement. Crime was not exactly rife on the Cooper. In the 3 years 1888, 89, 90, they dealt with 1 attempted suicide, 2 larcenies, 1 case of threatening language, 1 attempt at arson, and 1 breach each of the Crown Lands Act, the Licensed Victuallers Act, the Dog Act, and the Licensed Hawkers Act. However, the routine task could become dramatic, as when in 1891 the collection of census papers saw the constable swimming the horses over many flooded creeks. On another occasion, the collection was interrupted by the call to search for a missing man. This particular collection took 2 months, covered 1,930 kilometres, and netted precisely 80 census papers. The officer in charge during the late 1880s and early 1890s was one William Jukes. Plague rats, dingoes and grasshoppers made life unpleasant. These, with a savage summer, must have shortened tempers, for Jukes found himself suddenly less than popular. A petition for his removal, bearing 12 signatures, was sent to his superiors. Asked by them to comment, Jukes judged the man responsible to be the publican, who had a grievance against Jukes because he neither frequented the pub nor allowed his junior to do so. Of the other signatories, 3 didn't live in the area, and the rest had come under Jukes' official notice at various times and could be described as biased. Jukes concluded his reply with the virtuous remark, "It's my endeavour to carry out my duties to the satisfaction of the Inspector of the Division, and not to court the popularity of bush publicans and the rabble who follow in their wake." The petition was refused. There was a feeling of progress in the area at this time. A township was surveyed at Inaminka, and there were hopes of an increase in both population and prosperity. Mounted Constable Radford bought one of the township blocks when they were auctioned. It was to prove a poor investment, as the township remained at the minimum of pub, store, boarding house, so-called, I have heard it spelled a different way, saddler's shop, residence and cemetery. In 1891 there were prospects of trouble in the local shearing sheds following on the growing unrest in the industry between pastoralists and unionists. Cordillo Downs Station, which is somewhat to the north of Inaminka, worried by news of arson, riots, train wrecking, larceny, assault and intimidation that had taken place in other areas, and aware of unionist shearers in the district, appealed for police protection for the non-union shearers. Mounted Constable Jukes was ahead of the game, however, and with his junior and the Diamantina police patrolled the sheds. There was no trouble in the Cooper shearing sheds that year. When Jukes left in 1891, his place as officer in charge was taken by the notorious William Wilshire. While serving in the Northern Territory, Wilshire was arrested for the murder of Aborigines, tried and acquitted amidst great publicity. On his reinstatement in the force, he was posted to Inaminka. They got all the good ones. He was there only for a few months, and there is no record of his activities. Prior to this, he had published some pamphlets on the Central Australian Aborigines, and at about this time another appeared, possibly prepared while at Inaminka. He also wrote a long letter to the Adelaide Advertiser after the Elder expedition, boasting of his own exploits in the north and revealing self-confidence bordering on arrogance. He also launched into verse, which was published. The verse, like his reputation, was rather bad. By 1887, the Cooper country was considered safe enough for a man to travel alone, and the station at Inaminka was reduced to 2 men until 1902, when it became a one-man station. In 1904, Mounted Constable Charles Keane moved into the police station at Inaminka. Having been vacant for 3 months, it was in poor repair, and Keane spent a couple of weeks getting it habitable before going on patrol. When he returned, he found a disaster. I quote, somewhat edited, from his report. "I found the police station here nearly a total wreck from the effects of a severe storm which passed over here. The old veranda shifted first and lifted the iron of the roof with it and tumbled down slabs in all directions and caused the ceilings to collapse and also 2 windows stove in. Some of the iron of the roof I found a mile from here and in such battered condition that it is of no further use. It is not safe to stay inside without one is constantly on the alert in expectation of some portion of same falling in. The store and saddle room suffered also, and I have been working on that since to try and get it done up. My limited knowledge and tools made the work difficult to complete. Charles Keane, like some of his predecessors, had to take refuge in the hotel until the station could be repaired. Life at Inaminka proceeded on its quiet way until early in 1906. That summer was unusually hot even for the Cooper, temperatures soaring into the 40s and 50s for days on end. In February, heavy rains fell in western Queensland, and Inaminka had almost daily thunderstorms and rain. The Cooper flooded and continued to rise. The little town was badly damaged by rain and the flooding river. Once more, Keane was homeless, and his report to the Commissioner surely reveals an undercurrent of despair. "I have the honour to report that on March the 12th I had to abandon the station here on account of the Coopers Creek flood, and the waters rose up to 4 feet 10 in the house, and the whole of one end and the chimney collapsed, and the water caused all the pug to tumble down from the walls, and the flooring is all washed away, and the building is, I may state, a total wreck, and I think almost beyond repair. This is the 3rd time the house has suffered from the floodwaters. I would venture to suggest that another structure be erected on higher ground." Once more, Keane was a boarder at the hotel. When the floods receded, the country was a morass. Once the mails began to move again, they brought a series of irritable letters from the Superintendent of Public Buildings in Adelaide, querying the excessive rent, 12 shillings a week, needed to put a roof over Keane's head, demanding a list of salvageable materials from the ruined police station and the cost of transport and so forth. Keane replied with admirable patience that he could find only 60 sheets of iron, 32 lengths of timber from what had been the new veranda, and a reusable door. Land freight by camel was then £10 per tonne. An unhappy bureaucracy in Adelaide fell silent for months, and a year after the flood, Keane started the repairs himself with borrowed materials, and so the shaky old station was propped up again. Keane was a popular officer. He donated a good conduct prize for the tiny school and was regarded with real affection by the local children. He kept a firm hand on potential lawbreakers and showed a marked degree of sympathy for the local Aborigines, buying extra rations at great expense from the store to supplement the scanty government rations during the drought. When in early 1910 he was transferred, the Observer's correspondent in the township described him as a most courteous, capable and efficient officer, besides being popular in the community, adding, "The almost total absence of crime in this district for the last 5 years speaks well for this gentleman's attention to duties." The paper also credited Keane with 2 records, that of length of tenure and of distance travelled on duty, Keane being the first solo constable stationed at Inaminka. In 1912, the new mounted constable who arrived at Inaminka was a member of a family which has a tradition of police service going back to 1849. Albert George Ewens was one of the 3rd generation of the Ewens family to enlist in the force. He soon reported a local tragedy. Work was being done on the government wells on the Strzelecki track to keep the track open in a dry year. At Napakungi well, the contractor had his mate working about 40 feet down the well. Without warning, the sides of the old well collapsed. The workmen had time to shout to be pulled up as earth and timber came down on the staging and bucket. Those above clung to the windlass until the weight twisted both handles off. The staging held for a minute, then the rope broke and let everything down to the bottom about 70 feet below, followed by more falls of earth. There was nothing to be done but read the burial service and fill in the well. Later, iron railings and a headstone were erected over the deepest grave on the track. During Bertie Ewan's time at Inaminka, he also saw the recurrent community tragedy of drought. Regular patrols were made difficult by a lack of feed for the police horses, and some died from eating poisonous foliage. 40,000 cattle died in the district, some dropping on the bare ground, others bogged in the margins of the waterholes to be eaten alive by dingoes. The heat drove men to strange deeds. A shooter came on the tracks of hobnailed boots crossing the floodplain of the Cooper and deduced from their meanderings that the man was lost. He backtracked and eventually found an old man under a bush. Thirsty and beginning to hallucinate from heat stroke, the old man assumed from his rescuer's khaki shirt and trousers and large feet in tan boots that he must be the police. As they headed back to the river, the old man confessed to cold-blooded murder, describing the cutting of old Joe's throat at the fence rider's hut in lurid detail, miming his actions with the help of a knife with grey hairs still sticking to the bloodstains. After giving the murderer a good meal, the shooter set out for the township to hand him over to justice, somewhat struck by the irony of having saved his life only so that he could hang. On the way, they met Mounted Constable Ewans with his tracker. It turned out that he was looking for the old man, but only because the fence rider was worried about him. It appeared that in exasperation at its thieving habits, he had cut the throat of the fence rider's old billy goat, Joe, and fearing the owner's wrath, fled into the wilderness. So much for bloody murder, at least on that occasion. Bertie Ewans also kept a paternal eye on the 70 Aborigines at Inaminka as well as the nomadic groups. He wrote to the Aborigines office in 1915. Most of them are now very old people and suffer greatly from bad teeth. If you will kindly supply me with an assortment of about 4 pairs of forceps, I will undertake to extract teeth for these poor old people, which will greatly alleviate their sufferings. The instruments were sent, and dentistry was added to his list of duties. There is a story that one young constable, desperate after long years in the hideous climate and loneliness of the Cooper, took himself down to the city to beard the commissioner in his den and plead for a transfer, only to be summarily sent back. It could well have been Bertie Ewans. He left the Cooper in 1920, having served there for just over 8 years, by a small margin the longest term any constable was to spend at Inaminka. The 1920s were a time of declining population on the Cooper and increasing drought. Frequent changes of staff occurred at the Inaminka police station, and in 1923-24 no fewer than 4 different constables held the fort there. The final attempt to fill the post was the arrival of James Robert Dupuy. In later years, the assertion by Dupuy that he was of the French nobility was greeted with the indulgent smirks reserved for the ravings of noted eccentrics. It was nevertheless the truth. The Dupuys were French Huguenots who fled France in the late 17th century to escape religious persecution and settled in Switzerland. One of the last Barons Dupuy married an English girl and migrated to Australia, where he joined the police force in 1886, serving only briefly before taking up farming. His son James Robert Dupuy also joined the force in 1915, and after transferring to the mounted police was eventually posted to Inaminka. He began energetically with 7 arrests in 2 years, which might not sound much until you remember the tiny population of his district. He showed initiative in his remote outpost. He realised there was a market for pictures of the Outback, and as a keen photographer was able to sell a number of prints to the press of the day. Unfortunately, he found less innocent outlets for his initiative. One of the few animals to thrive in the drought was the dingo. In an attempt at control, a bonus was offered for dingo scalps. This proved a temptation for the dishonest, who were careful to retain enough breeding dogs to maintain the supply and with it their future income. As well as the manipulation of supply, it was probably inevitable that someone would realise that it was also possible to get the bonus without even producing the scalps. Under the system of the 1920s, doggers had to sign a declaration stating the number of scalps collected. An authorised person then issued a certificate to this effect, authorised payment of the bonus, then destroyed the scalps. The Lands Department, on receipt of this certificate, paid the bonus. The authorised receiver of dog scalps at Inaminka was Dupuy. After a time, an essential weakness in the system came to his notice, and thereafter the number of wild dogs allegedly destroyed in his district soared. He set up what he saw as a foolproof system. 3 local doggers were persuaded to sign declarations that they had taken actually more scalps than had been produced, which declaration Dupuy accepted. He issued the certificates and burnt various kinds of rubbish to give the impression of destroying dog scalps. The 4 men shared the profits of this inflation of the numbers. All this was no secret in the community, but despite many friendly warnings that he was overdoing it, Dupuy persisted. When in one year the records showed that 7,000 dogs had been disposed of, even the Lands Department noticed, and an inquiry was initiated. After an investigation, Dupuy and 2 accomplices were arrested, and an exceedingly depressed and contrite constable was taken to Port Augusta for sentencing. Dupuy was jailed for 3 years and of course dismissed from the force. He served his time in Yatala. A woman friend had taken over the Inaminka Hotel, and he returned there when freed, ostensibly to work for her, but for all practical purposes in charge of the establishment. He became one of their local characters, staying at the hotel until 1949, when he moved to the Walkeringa Hotel, where he remained until he died in 1963. He was, in fact, the last publican at Walkeringa. He is remembered by former residents of the Inaminka district with more amusement than censure. After all, defrauding the government is more of an Australian sport than a crime. Life became a little safer on the Cooper with the building of the Australian Inland Mission Nursing Home, which was known as the Elizabeth Simon Home, which opened in 1929 with a staff of 2 nursing sisters. There was an added bonus for the constables in the shape of eligible and attractive young women, and all those constables subsequently stationed there did in fact marry sisters from the nursing home. In the middle of 1930, the constable who arrived at Inaminka was in many ways perhaps an unlikely man to actively enjoy life in the Outback. John Finn was a well-spoken, keenly intelligent Englishman, well-read, something of an expert in medieval history and Australian exploration, fond of music with a good tenor singing voice, played a good game of tennis. He fell in love with this, his first posting as officer in charge, and remembered it with affection for the rest of his life. Finn patrolled mostly by motorcar, the police now having no horses or camels of their own at Inaminka. Simple journeys were complicated by the primitive roads. Once, returning from leave, he left Broken Hill on the 17th of February. Next day, close to Tibooburra, which is in the far northwestern corner of New South Wales, after heavy rain, the car was caught in a flooded creek and he had to walk 5 kilometres with his passenger, who was one of the nursing sisters, into town. After a week's wait for the country to dry out, he set off again, only to have the car develop ignition trouble. Finn walked 20 kilometres to the nearest station for a part. On the 27th of February, they resumed the journey, only to have the battery fall out of the car and shatter. Then they had to camp where they were to await the mail car, due early in March. When their supplies ran out, they lived on dried apricots and water until they were picked up. When they finally arrived in Inaminka, they had spent 14 days on a trip that can be done in 2 days. An outbreak of gastroenteritis during his time killed the only white child in his entire district, a 4-year-old on Inaminka Station. Finn dug the small grave and attended the funeral, then took stern measures to stem the outbreak. Believing the epidemic to be caused by the stagnant water from the nearby waterhole, he ordered that all drinking water be boiled. He moved the Aborigines from the waterhole to a new camp where they could dig soaks for water, and burned the old wurleys, ordered the digging of latrines, and shot all the excess camp dogs. The health department was later to comment that he had done all that could be done, and the outbreak was in fact contained. Finn had a particular admiration for the Aborigines' tracking ability. The station always had a native constable attached, mostly for his tracking skills. The trackers appeared regularly in the station journal under the name of Sambo and bore such nicknames as Willie Coon, Napoleon or Jack the Ripper. This had no effect on their skills. I can give you some idea of one tracking exercise with two Aborigines in Finn's own words. This white fellow was a pretty good bushman, and he did everything he could to prevent us following him. If he came to a clear patch that he had to cross, he'd go round the perimeter of it, and the only way we could catch him would be faint tracks on the clay surface. If there was herbage of any sort, he would step from one clump to another to throw the tracks off. We lost his tracks, couldn't find them at all. I sat down on a little bank in the bottom of the creek, and Napoleon came along and said, "There him goes, see?" Now, if I said I could see those tracks, I'd be telling a damned lie. The only thing I could find was that the surface of the ground was somewhat lighter at certain spots than it was at certain other spots. We followed them, and he said, "Look, him sit there, see?" And this fellow had sat in the low branch of a tree and pulled his feet up, and dirt from his feet had fallen in the bark, and Napoleon had picked that up. He came to a root crossing a small channel in the creek, and the only way we picked him up was that he trod on a tuft of grass, and there was just a faint heel impression where his heel had touched the ground. We were on his tracks a fair while, then we lost them. Whether he died in that country, I don't know. He just disappeared. Finn left Inaminka in 1937. His subsequent career was one of great distinction. His retirement was busy and fruitful until his death in 1980. He summed up his years on the Cooper with the simple comment, "It was a hard life being a copper." The last constable to serve at Inaminka was Donald Simpkin, who arrived in 1945. The most dramatic event of his stay on the Cooper was the Great Flood of 1949-50. That was the flood that flowed right down into Lake Eyre, and people were able to go boating, and Eric Benithan was one of them, and traced the Cooper, the lower Cooper, and went out into the lake. Incredibly heavy rains deluged the region to bring the Cooper and its tributaries out of its banks to cover vast areas and form an inland sea. At Inaminka, the river rose steadily up the hill to the door of the wash house of the police station, still higher to wash under the house and lap the floorboards. The police boat could be moored at the gate, and tortoises were caught on fishing lines set just outside the door. Simpkin and his wife took refuge in the nursing home clear of the floods. While the rains were a bonus for the pastoralists, there was one small snag as far as Simpkin was concerned. The publican had given him a dozen bottles of beer as a Christmas present, and these had been lowered into the station well to keep cool. The flood swirled into the well and silted it up, and despite the best efforts of half a dozen thirsty men, there the beer stayed, a buried treasure tantalisingly out of reach. Progress caught up with the Cooper as the 50s began. The flying doctor service and the availability of transceivers had made the Elizabeth Simon nursing home redundant, and it closed in 1951. The hotel, unconventionally run, to say the least, by the wife of a drover, posed a real problem to law and order. Under pressure for reform and renovation from Simpkin, the drover closed the hotel. The real necessity to retain a police station here was now gone, and the department decided to close it. Police property, the station, punt and boat used at the Cooper crossing, were offered for sale without finding any buyers. Which is not really surprising, because although the new police station was the new police station, still in 1950, it was wooden iron and apparently wasn't even lined. It was just wooden iron with the timbers on the inside, which wasn't really too bad because there were also no cupboards, no shelves, nothing in the kitchen except a wood stove. So one policeman told me that his wife was able to use the internal timbers as shelves for groceries. Anyhow, the station officially closed on the 31st of December 1952, and after attending to the inevitable relevant paperwork, Simpkin closed the station door for the last time at 11 a.m. on the 4th of January 1953. So ended the Inaminka years. Sometime between then and 1957, the police station was accidentally burned to the ground. The timber and iron cell, however, was salvaged to become a tool room at Inaminka Station. Of the 34 constables in all who served at Inaminka, I've talked about only 9 to illustrate something of what life was like on the Cooper for a policeman. Many of the others had equally interesting experience, which, were they all told, would create a fascinating tapestry of patience, endurance, quirks of character, humour and oddity. Some served with distinction, some were dismissed in disgrace, some were likeable and some unpopular. Most, however, did their duty as it was laid down for them, despite the city bureaucracy's ignorance of the real circumstances of their lives. The Cooper community owes them a debt of great gratitude. If I remember rightly, that was Constable Provis, and he died of pleurisy. Apart from that, I know nothing else. Occasionally you hear a story that he killed himself or something like that, but although there was one Inaminka policeman who at a later posting did in fact take his own life, it wasn't Provis. He died of pleurisy. That's according to the official records. Yes, well, yes, but the Northern Flinders was settled then, and yes, there were wells, and there was a native well at the lower part of the Strzelecki track, and a number of natural water holes that are filled when the Strzelecki track, when the Strzelecki Creek runs, which is very seldom. Some of them last for a few years. Occasionally they fill from local rains. Once you got onto the actual Cooper, there would be no problem at all about water. And presumably for the dry stages, they carried water bags, well, those camel metal water carriers, to carry them over. For instance, going across dirt stony desert, they would have been dependent usually on water that they carried, although on that particular patrol, if you remember, they they had recent rains and there would be a little surface water still about. I didn't pick up any reference to it when I was doing the research on the police side of the Cooper history. Mount Freeling was the police station at the beginning, sort of in the early 70s, and then that closed. It was the Mount Freeling police station which received the report of Redford's journey down the Strzelecki with his stolen herd. It was those policemen who investigated initially. The story of police involvement with the Aborigines of the Cooper area is a very interesting story, which I really felt I couldn't do justice to in a paper of this length. There were great difficulties on the Diamantina, and a number of reprisals and some murders and various other incidents in that area. But generally speaking, the Aboriginal people on the Cooper seem to have been a very peaceable people. Sturt spoke very highly of them when he first met them. Burke and Wills initially were afraid of them, and it wasn't until really the very last that John King felt able to throw themselves on their mercy. Once settlement came, I've only been able to track down one single report of an attack on the settlers. This is apart from difficulties that arose down around Lake Hope in the early days, where in fact the Aboriginal tribes of the Cooper did plan to eject the white settlers from the area, but they were very easily deterred when 2 or 3 troopers happened to turn up at the crucial moment. But one of the first permanent settlers on the Upper Cooper in this area was in fact attacked when he was left alone for about 3 months on his station, and his hut was surrounded at first light by Aborigines. But fortunately, his dogs woke him. He went out, his dogs attacked the Aborigine who was heading towards the hut, and in fact they all vanished. And because he let the Aborigine go, he got the reputation for being a good sort of a bloke, and also the owner of some very savage dogs. And in fact, from then on, in his own words, he had no more difficulties with the Aborigines. For the most part, I've been able to find no trustworthy evidence at all of any police reprisals in the Inner Minka district. There is a story of, on one occasion, the police from the Diamantina coming down into the Cooper area on a reprisal and apparently shooting some Aborigines. There were difficulties with one particular station manager who, in the words of somebody who knew him, had a real thing about Aborigines. He picked up a gun every time he saw one, and he is generally credited with having shot a great number. And in fact, during his period on the station, the number of Aborigines declined from a camp of about 500 down to a mere remnant of that number. Generally speaking, the police were on reasonably good terms with the local Aborigines, particularly in the later years. One of the only difficulties that arose was the requirement that part Aboriginal children be removed from their Aboriginal mothers. This caused a great deal of heartache, of course, to the children and to the mothers and other relatives in the Aboriginal camp. And unfortunately, the policeman, being the man who was delegated to do this, he was generally blamed for it, even though in many, certainly in the case of Constable Finn, he was deeply sympathetic to the Aborigines, and it was the duty he hated most. He was nevertheless blamed by some who'd been taken away and dispossessed of both cultures subsequently. So generally speaking, relations were fairly good, I would say. In fact, in some cases they were excellent. Finn himself was trusted to the point that he was allowed to attend the latter part of an initiation ceremony, and he learned a great deal about the Aborigines.